Americans seem to be changing their minds about the Chinese Communist regime drastically. For the first time ever, half of Americans consider it the top threat to the country. The Chinese Communist Party says China is a democracy in its own form. That's as Beijing complains about a freedom summit hosted by the U.S. One nation in Europe is boycotting the Beijing Olympics. Its announcement comes while Beijing blocks exports from the country. iPhone sales have taken the lead in the Chinese market. Apple is snapping up market share left behind by Huawei, as the tech giant has remained on the decline for 2 years. A major Chinese company plans to delist from the New York Stock Exchange. It's now feeling the pressure on two sides, from both the U.S. and China. And half of China's workforce reports a monthly income of less than $160. Communist Party officials, on the other hand, are getting rich. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. How do American people view the Chinese Communist Party? For the first time ever, over half of all Americans agree that one regime is the top threat for the United States, Communist China, not Russia, nor any other country. That's a dramatic change in public opinion since 2018. According to a new survey by the Ronald Reagan Institute, 52% of Americans named China when asked which country they see as the greatest threat to the U.S., while only 14% said Russia. The concern is shared by those on the left and right. 64% of Republican respondents said China is their top concern, followed by Democrats and independents, each at 44%. In contrast, only 21% view China as the top threat in 2018, when 30% said Russia. Economic factors were the top reason for concern for both Democrats and Republicans. Republicans named the military as the second reason, while Democrats pointed to human rights abuses. Also, nearly three-quarters of all respondents said they believed it was likely the CCP virus accidentally leaked from a lab in Wuhan, China, and that China's authorities have lied about it. The U.S. is pushing back against Beijing's criticism of its upcoming democracy summit. President Biden is set to host the virtual summit next week, and over 100 countries will come together to discuss how to protect democracy. The U.S. invited Taiwan, but China and Russia are not on the guest list. Beijing sees the summit as a challenge to its authoritarian rule, and a vice foreign minister criticized the summit without naming the U.S.
This actually reveals their hostile mindsets and intentions. Namely, democracy is just a tool to repress anyone who disagrees with them and to contain the development of other countries.
And here's the White House's response.
That's nothing we're going to apologize for, no matter what the criticism is from any country around the world.
Psaki adds that it's an opportunity to be clear that no democracy is perfect.
No democracy is perfect. No democracy is ever final. And we should continue to build on that, discuss, engage, encourage positive change.
The Chinese Communist Party says China has its own form of democracy. And this upcoming Saturday, Beijing is set to release a report called China Democracy That Works. The Chinese regime is complaining about a democracy summit hosted by the U.S., and Taiwan has some advice for the regime.
Taiwan is also reacting to Beijing's criticism of the summit.
So for all the governments and peoples around the world who feel maybe slighted that they have not been invited as a participant, my suggestion is to double down on realizing democracy so that maybe by the next round we will be sharing the same stage.
Tang, along with Taipei's de facto ambassador in Washington, will be representing Taiwan at next week's summit.
Against a backdrop of escalating China-Taiwan tensions this year, the number of U.S. military troops unofficially stationed in Taiwan has doubled. According to the Pentagon's Defense Manpower Data Center, the increase went from 20 personnel to 39 between December 31st last year and September 30th this year. Active duty deployments include 29 Marines, 2 Army service members, 3 from the Navy, and 5 from the Air Force. Although the U.S. did not disclose what the military personnel are doing on the island, the troops' presence there coincides with Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen confirming that American troops are on Taiwanese soil. Her verification came in an interview with CNN late October. She is the first president to give a public acknowledgement of this kind in the past 40 years. Beijing is strongly against the U.S. having troops in Taiwan, and the Chinese Foreign Ministry has previously said that it firmly opposes any form of military ties between the U.S. and Taiwan. Beijing claims self-governed Taiwan as its territory, and it's been buying Taiwan's diplomatic allies. Many turn to Beijing for its grand promises of wealth creation. However, protests in the Solomon Islands are an exception.
Protests in the Solomon Islands are drawing attention to Beijing's efforts to buy Taiwan's allies, and they're proving it's not always possible. Unrest swept across the Solomon Islands late November. Protesters traveled from the island of Malaita to the country's capital. They stormed the national parliament and set buildings in Chinatown on fire. A post on Twitter says that the only house not burnt in Chinatown was safe because it had a Taiwanese flag out front. Some experts say the unrest is a direct result of the country's 2019 decision, when the Solomon Islands decided to break diplomatic relations with Taiwan and turn to Beijing. Taiwan accused Beijing of its dollar diplomacy and making false promises. It said Beijing bribed Solomon Island politicians to compel them to abandon Taiwan. Experts say discontent from the island of Malaita has simmered for decades. Malaita is the most populous island in the Solomon Islands. Malaita continues to maintain relations with and receive support from Taiwan, while the central government does the same with Beijing. That has deepened the existing fracture and led to the most recent outbreak. Taiwan now has diplomatic relations with 15 countries. In the past almost 2 decades, Taiwan lost 17 diplomatic allies. Most of them, if not all, turned to Beijing. The Solomon Islands and Kiribati, an island nation in the Central Pacific Ocean, are the most recent. The Dominican Republic from the Caribbean region was converted in 2018. Beijing had been intensifying its trade with the country, and it became China's second largest trade partner in the region. After being diplomatically tied with Beijing, the country received over $3 billion in aid. The same amount of aid was provided to the Central American country Panama when it left Taiwan and turned to China in 2017. Beijing later invested over $8 billion in the country. Another island country in the Caribbean, Dominica, forged formal ties with China in 2004. Its then president say they turned to Beijing for a little less than $118 million in aid that Beijing promised.
Beijing is reportedly blocking a European country's trade exports to China. This as the country's president confirms a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics. NTD's Don Ma has more.
Lithuania said on Friday that China is blocking exports from the European country. This amid an ongoing spat between the two countries. Lithuania said that Beijing had delisted it as a country of origin. That means goods could not clear Chinese customs and are being rejected. Lithuania's foreign ministry says it will ask the European Commission to get involved and defend Lithuania's interests. A European Commission spokesperson said on Friday that they're working to clarify the situation. The Commission says they have been informed that the Lithuanian shipments are not being cleared through the Chinese customs and imports applications are being rejected. The trade bloc is likely not an official ban. Lithuania's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Education and Innovation both said they had not received any official information from China. The Chinese trade bloc is the latest move in a back and forth between the two countries. On Friday, the Lithuanian president confirmed a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics. Representatives of the president told Lithuanian news outlet LRT that the president does not intend to participate in the games, and the head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will also take the same position. Tensions between the two countries deteriorated after Lithuania's decision to allow Taiwan to open a de facto embassy there. On Thursday, Lithuanian members of parliament paid a visit to Taipei, even meeting with Taiwan's president. One parliamentarian said that the threat of China is increasingly more visible.
More and more European countries are starting to, backfire relations with China. They see what is happening in China, and they more and more see it as a threat to them.
Another member of parliament said Lithuania and Taiwan should share good practices, amid an increasingly threatening environment. Don Ma, NTD News.
Apple is now the largest smartphone vendor in China, replacing Vivo and before that Chinese telecom gear company Huawei. This, according to Business Standard, citing market research firm Counterpoint. Their report says Apple's sales grew 46% month over month, the highest among all major brands in China in October 2021. This after the U.S. sanctioned Huawei. Its sales dropped sharply over the past 2 years, making it the biggest casualty of Apple's growth. According to the research director of Counterpoint, Apple is gaining maximally for the gap left by Huawei in the premium segment. Chinese ride-hailing giant Didi announced on Friday it will be delisting from the New York Stock Exchange. The company's shares plunged by 20%. It's a result of the company giving in to pressure from Chinese regulators who flagged concerns about data security. The company will instead seek a listing in Hong Kong.
Didi was already facing heat from Beijing when it decided to push ahead with its $4.4 billion IPO back in June, despite being asked to put those plans on hold. That's as authorities were investigating the company's data practices. Regulators later ordered app stores to delete 25 mobile apps run by Didi and told the company to stop registering new users over concerns around national security. Sources, however, have told Reuters that Didi is preparing to relaunch the apps by year's end, in anticipation of the probe wrapping up by then. Didi shares were down over 40% on Thursday since its listing. The firm's latest move sent jitters across global markets, sparking worries over the broader impact on U.S.-China tensions as Beijing continues its wider crackdown on big tech.
And pressure on Chinese companies isn't only coming from the Chinese authorities, but also from American stock market regulators. On Thursday, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission finalized rules asking foreign companies listed in the U.S. to hand in audit books and declare whether they are owned or controlled by any foreign government. But Chinese regulators had always denied such requests. A CEO of a Hong Kong fund management company says for Chinese companies listed in the U.S., it's like walking on eggshells trying to please both sides. He added delisting makes things simpler. The threat of default loomed over Chinese property firm Kaisa on Friday. The company announced it had failed in talks with offshore bondholders to extend the maturity of a $400 million debt payment due next week.
Kaisa has now begun talks with some of those bondholders over extending the deadline. That's according to two sources close to the matter. A group of offshore bondholders who say they own 50% of the debt in question sent Kaisa a letter earlier this week. They offered extra time to negotiate the repayment of the bond and avoid a default. They also put forward an offer to provide $2 billion of fresh funding to the company, but sources say major progress has not been made on the offer. Shares in the troubled Chinese firm dropped sharply on Friday at almost 9%. The stock has fallen around 75% so far this year. Kaisa said it was still looking into selling assets and extending or renewing debt obligations, but the company cautioned there was no guarantee it would be able to meet the December 7th maturity deadline. Kaisa is second behind Evergrande as the largest dollar bond issuer among Chinese property firms. Evergrande is also in trouble with more than $300 billion in liabilities. Like Kaisa, Evergrande has looked for ways to raise capital to fight off a default.
And it looks like it's difficult for Evergrande to raise money. China's second largest property developer says the company may not be able to pay its debts. Multiple governing bodies are now involved, and they released notices trying to reassure the broader Chinese property market.
On Friday, the company said there is no guarantee it will have enough funds to meet debt repayments. The statement came in a filing to the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. The crisis prompted the local provincial government of Guangdong to summon Evergrande's chairman, Hui Ka-yan. The authorities said that at Evergrande's request, they had sent a working group to oversee its risk management and daily operations. And it's not the only government body that waded into the Evergrande issue on Friday. Other players include China's central bank, the regime banking and insurance regulator, and its securities regulator. They released statements trying to reassure the market that any risk to the broader property sector would be kept under control.
Chinese tennis player Peng Shuai's whereabouts is of increasing concern for the global community, and some analysts say this growing pressure may change the attitudes of some profit-driven entities.
The Association of Tennis Professionals, or ATP, is joining the chorus calling for Chinese tennis star Peng Shuai's safety. The organization governs men's professional tennis circuits. It says it'll be keeping an eye on Peng's situation, though it hasn't commented on whether a suspension of tournaments in China is on the table, a move that would involve hundreds of millions of dollars. Questions about a possible ATP suspension follow the Women's Tennis Association, or WTA's, lead. The group decided Thursday to suspend tournaments in China over fears for the former doubles world champion. The controversy first sparked after Peng accused China's former vice premier Zhang Gaoli of sexual assault on social media in November. She wasn't seen in public for nearly 3 weeks afterward. Beijing responded soon after the WTA's announcement, but didn't mention the association by name. Instead, the statement opposed what it called the politicization of sports. At the same time, a reporter from China's state-backed English-language broadcaster, CGTN, commented via Twitter Thursday. He wrote that his confirmed source told him that Peng Shuai had sent an email to WTA chair Steve Simon, urging him not to quote out of context and to stop making remarks that exploit her privacy. The reporter didn't clarify the identity or credentials of the source. A number of national tennis federations around the world are now standing with the WTA in its effort to protect athletes' human rights. Tennis Canada says it respects the WTA's leadership and described the need to keep young female competitors safe as essential. The Italian Tennis Federation also offered full support, noting it would aid the WTA on request, while Tennis Australia said Peng's health and well-being would remain a priority. Despite the widespread support, some organizations are taking a more cautious approach. According to sports marketing analysts, the National Basketball Association and England's Premier League, or EPL, are unlikely to confront Beijing over Peng Shuai.
Well, they're certainly feeling some pressure. There's no doubt that the NBA and the English Premier League both look pretty weak in the face of the WTA. That being said, again, the NBA has a $1.5 billion rights deal to broadcast games in China, and the EPL just signed a new deal that must be somewhere in roughly the $700 million range.
Neither the NBA nor Premier League immediately responded to requests for comment. Amid the public outcry, the International Olympic Committee has remained firmly in the hot seat. It has so far attempted to reassure those concerned that Peng is safe, seeing major public pushback in the process. That's as it prepares to host the Winter Olympics in Beijing early next year. Former tennis player Martina Navratilova recently challenged the IOC on Twitter, saying she can barely hear the IOC's attempts to stand up for Peng.
More than any of these leagues, organizations, is about the money, money, money. It'll be really interesting to see how this all plays out, because there it's only going to get more intense and more protests and more pressure from outside groups about where that goes.
On Thursday, the IOC revealed it held a second video call with Peng, saying she appeared to be doing fine. When asked for comment, the IOC reiterated it would meet with Peng personally in January.
A human rights activist is calling out the International Olympic Committee. He says the IOC's video calls with Chinese tennis star Peng Shuai are obviously staged on the Chinese side and that the calls are putting her at greater risk. Activist Peter Dallin cited his personal experience of being detained in China. The Guardian says in 2016, the Swedish NGO founder was held in a Chinese black prison for 23 days before being forced to appear on Chinese state TV to confess his crimes. In a Twitter post, he wrote, "Dear IOC, here is me being safe and well and speaking freely to help the CCP counter international criticism. This was the part cameras didn't show." A picture illustrates his forced TV confession in China, with a group of Chinese police watching on behind the camera. Over 220 million people's average income is less than $80 a month. That's about 1/6 of the Chinese population. This is part of an investigative report published last month by a leading Chinese investment banking firm. If the threshold rises to $160 a month, 770 million people could not reach it. That's more than half of the Chinese population. The report from China International Capital Corporation echoes Chinese Premier Li Keqiang's remarks last year. He said over 600 million people in China can barely make a monthly income of $160. That's not enough to rent a room in Chinese cities. The investigation also found that only 5% of the Chinese population can make a per capita income of over $800 monthly. Compared to regular citizens, officials of the Chinese Communist Party seem to have easier ways to get rich. Chinese state media says some officials have been sentenced to prison for corruption. Using their positions, most had embezzled hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. More people seem to be leaving Hong Kong than before, and they are taking quite a bit of wealth. Hong Kong residents leaving the city for good withdrew over $300 million from their mandatory pension accounts in the third quarter, within a mere 3 months. That's an increase of over 50% from a year earlier. The Mandatory Provident Fund is a major pension fund in Hong Kong. Most employees and employers are required to pay into it monthly. Over 9,000 claims were made during the third quarter. The fund spokesperson explains these claims may not only be from locals leaving the city, but also from non-local employees who leave Hong Kong when their contracts expire, adding sometimes one person can make multiple claims. Beijing imposed a national security law in Hong Kong last year. The law makes anything Beijing regards as subversion, secession, terrorism, or collusion with foreign forces punishable by up to life in prison. The sweeping law is driving many Hong Kong residents away from the Asian financial hub, and they have taken tens of billions of dollars with them. Permanent departure claims increased by over 3,000 in the 12 months ending in September, compared to the same period the year before. A survey shows that amid the emigration wave in the last academic year, Hong Kong's secondary schools lost about 1,000 teachers. That's double the year before. And now some updates on China's virus situation. After a virus outbreak in Mengzhou City, Inner Mongolia, yet another district has been designated a medium-risk area for the virus. That's as the health authorities report more cases there. Mass virus testing is underway in the city. As of midday Thursday, nearly 180,000 tests have been administered in a fourth round of mass virus testing. 4 rounds of mass testing may seem like a lot, but it's still not over. A 5th round is already underway, and more than 110,000 tests have been administered. The outbreak in Inner Mongolia is starting to spread to other areas as well. In Harbin City, Heilongjiang Province, at least 3 new local virus cases have been confirmed, and all of them were close contacts of virus patients in Mengzhou City. However, we cannot verify this figure independently. Cases have spread from Heilongjiang to Beijing as well. A local in Beijing told us that stores in the area he lived were prohibited from opening as of Thursday afternoon. Another local says some entrances to residential buildings have been sealed off. And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.